estaba explicando que me han pedido que hable en inglés. I have forgotten my English. It was very good when I was a boy, but I have stayed a very long part of my life in Paris, where the language is French, as you know, and then in Madrid. But well, I am not at all an expert in Shakespeare, and Gordon is a great expert, and I think he will do the most solid part of the talking.
I'll try.
But I belong to a generation of writers in Chile and then in the Spanish writing where we read different things. I think this was almost an obsession of my generation. Not to read the old criollistas from Chile or Argentina or Peru, and instead we read Borges, almost exceptionally. And the poetry of the young Neruda, not the poetry that he was writing in our days, but the poetry he wrote in the Far East when he was in English colonies. And I think Neruda began to read Shakespeare in those days because in Burma he had a very bad time. And he wrote a verse that says, "Those terrible Englishmen that I hate till today, esos espantosos ingleses que odio todavía." But then, when he arrived to Ceylon, to Colombo, he met a group of poets who had been the disciples of, how was the name of Woolf?
Virginia Woolf.
Leonard Woolf, the husband of Virginia.
Leonard, yeah.
Yes. And so there he found English poets, and he began to study very well English poetry. And so, well, let's say, my generation read that Neruda, Borges, Kafka, Marcel Proust, and William Shakespeare, I would say. And we saw the films of Shakespeare of those days, the Shakespeare by Laurence Olivier. So I would like to ask Gordon what he thinks now of that, those films, Laurence Olivier's Shakespeare.
I was actually very fortunate a few years ago to meet a wonderful woman called Helga Keller, who had been Olivier's film editor for the Hamlet and the Richard III. So I was hearing all about the process of editing, particularly the scene in the Hamlet where Hamlet's going up the staircase and it becomes what's happening inside his mind. And it's quite fascinating watching the Olivier films now, particularly Richard III, and realizing how quickly something that appears very new and radical in Shakespeare performance, how quickly it becomes something that looks historical. So if you listen to the very, very earliest sound recordings of Henry Irving doing the "Now is the winter of our discontent" speech from Richard III, you can see how that comes through in Olivier as he does the same speech. And what I find, one of the most frustrating things about performance history, theatre history, is that every generation thinks its generation of actors are the most amazingly naturalistic ever. 10 years later, they sound stiff, awkward, uncomfortable, archaic. And the problem is, each stage of theatre history doesn't describe what the actors are doing. It says they're amazingly realistic and naturalistic, which doesn't actually tell you a thing, because it's always relative to the moment in which it's being said. So I think now the Olivier films, which came across in the 1940s and 50s as being astonishingly fresh and vibrant, look like period pieces to me. And yet, of course, when you watch, for example, I don't know if you have seen the Ian McKellen film of Richard III, it's very aware of Olivier's performance, just as Olivier was aware of his predecessors. And I think that sense that major actors do acquire a sense of what their predecessors have done, and they work both within and against that heritage. And it's not that things are completely renewed, it's that they're always in a dialogue between the past forms of performance and the projections of future forms of performance.
Well, I will tell you a very surprising moment in my life as a young man. I saw the Hamlet by Olivier, then I read it. I think I read it twice or 3 times. And then I was in a room in La Reina, in Santiago, in a house near the Cordillera, in winter, con una chimenea, with a chimney working, and suddenly a door opened in that room, big room, and I saw Laurence Olivier coming in. I thought I was dreaming, but it happened that the man who owned that house had a relation with the British Council. And Olivier was invited to Chile, and he came with Vivian Lee. I saw Olivier and Lee, I almost fainted the impression. But I have the impression also that Shakespeare, as a literary influence by his poetry, had a big influence in some members of the Chilean literary world. And I would say mainly Neruda, who made even a translation of Romeo and Juliet, and Nicanor Parra, who has been reading Shakespeare all the time since 10 years ago or more, and he translated King Lear very cleverly, but always wanting to stress that Shakespeare was an anti-poet, un antipoeta, which is not convincing for me at all, because the next step would be to say that Shakespeare was under the influence of Nicanor Parra, which I doubt very much. But he loved what he called the blank verse. He loved it because he thought that this gave an openness and a freedom for the poet, for the writer, that was unique. And I would say one thing. The great difference that I see between Shakespeare and some contemporaries of him in Europe, especially Cervantes in Spain and Montaigne in France, in Bordeaux, in the Aquitaine region, is that they were very good prose writers, wonderful good prose writers, but they were not poets. And they suffered because they knew they were not poets. There is exactly a poem by Cervantes saying that he had the sadness of understanding that he was not a poet, a real poet. And Shakespeare, I think, is one of the most wonderful poets that have existed in our world. And in this moment, for instance, I am not, as I say, I'm not a good knower of Shakespeare, but I am particularly interested in reading very well the sonnets of Shakespeare. And I don't know if Gordon agrees that one must read the sonnets to have a complete view of Shakespeare.
I think you do. I think there is a real danger of treating Shakespeare only as a playwright, when, from his perspective, it looks as if what mattered more to him was being a poet, because he seems to have been involved in the publication of his sonnets and his poems in a way that he wasn't involved in the publication of his plays, by and large. And it was very clear that at that time, to be a poet was a positive identity. To be a playwright was not. So the Bodleian Library in Oxford had, they were offered, no, at a certain point in the 17th century, they found that they had a load of quarto texts of Shakespeare and other playwrights from the period, and they got rid of them because they weren't literature. And they then had to spend a couple of hundred years trying to spend a lot of money to get them back when it dawned on them that this was a mistake. But at that time, being a poet was the key thing, not being a playwright. And you can see that when in one of the many 400s that we're marking in 2016 is 400 years since Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's awkward, difficult friend and rival, since he published the book that he called his Works, which was simply plays. And he was laughed at by everybody for calling plays works. Works could only be poems. But he was determined to make plays into something classically based and appropriate. But it was clear that for Shakespeare and his contemporaries, poems such as the sonnets mattered more than plays. Yeah.
Now I think poetry today is essentially suspicion for every establishment, so it is not the same thing. Yeah. We could ask Donald Trump about it, maybe.
Let's not.
Huh? But
he wouldn't know what we were talking about anyway.
No,
it'd be too complicated for him. Just like global warming is too complicated for him as well.
But let me tell you my recent experience with Shakespeare as a non-specialist that I am. I read a lot Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, in a certain way the inventor in the French language of the essay as a literary genre. And there is a very notable essay, very famous essay, called Les Cannibales, the Cannibals. And it is an essay where Montaigne tries to demonstrate that cannibals are more human and more civilized than the Catholics of his time, because he says cannibals have to kill a man quickly without making suffer in order to eat him. Whereas the Catholics, for religious theories, burned slowly the man and tortured him to death. So I prefer a cannibal. And then he spoke of places where cannibals live. And this speech of Montaigne about those places is very similar to the speech of Don Quixote about the golden ages, where all was, the property of things was common to everybody, the property of woman also, he said. And there was a sort of a paradise, communist, prehistoric paradise, something of that kind. No? A sort of utopia, very beautiful. But in Montaigne you find this. But then I have been reading The Tempest, and I see that Shakespeare knew very well the essay by Montaigne, I think, by an English translation. Florio, somebody called Florio. And in The Tempest, I find all a play about magic things and about a different world where some of the characters of the cannibals of Montaigne is found again.
One of the things that's fascinating about The Tempest is that it's pretty much the only play that Shakespeare wrote that we don't know the source for the story. We know he stole his stories for every other play. We know that he was an adapter of other people's writing. The Tempest, the actual plot of The Tempest, we don't know where that came from. But there is, as Jorge has said, a key moment where his, one of the king's slightly groveling courtiers, to distract the king from thinking about the fact that he believes his son has just drowned, talks or imagines what it would be like to colonize the island that they've landed on. So it's the speech that primarily has made literary critics relate The Tempest to the New World. But it's also a speech in which Gonzalo, the character who speaks the Montaigne passage, is constantly interrupted by Prospero's disloyal brother and his own sidekick, so that you simultaneously hear the positive utopian ideals of the speech, and you have it undercut by real politics, where how can I describe them? The Donald Trump figures in the play aren't listening to the imaginative language of the other courtier, and it means that you are left very unsure how you were supposed to respond to the contradictions that carry through from the Montaigne. That, on the one hand, this is supposed to be a realm of freedom, but it requires slaves to do all the work for you. It's supposed to be a realm of freedom for humans, but women are spoken of as property. So it's a very complicated passage, which a good production should make you feel, it should be uplifting and disturbing at the same time.
Well, I love the character of Prospero. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, Prospero.
Less elegantly than that.
All right, well, because Prospero has lost power, but he's a man who has books. And so my first reaction, if you are a man of books, you probably lose power and lose money. It's a very complicated situation. And then Prospero is a magician. And he corresponds to that idea that continued till Thomas Mann until today in many writers, of the artist as a sort of a magician, and the use of words is related to magic. So it was very fascinating for me, and I thought maybe Prospero is the most autobiographical character of Shakespeare. I am not sure, but maybe Shakespeare was thinking of the man of letters and the poet when he created this person. But Then there is a wonderful verse about men being made of the matter of dreams or something like that, which is very fascinating if you see that this verse is applied to the existence of a great poet-magician. And the idea of the poet-magician is also traditional, and it exists in our poetry. In Vicente Huidobro, he said, I don't remember exactly the verse, but he said that he is a magician and a little god. You know that poets are not very humble. And Vicente Huidobro was extremely arrogant and very intelligent, but a bit naive. And this made the combination of elements in his poetry that's very interesting for me, because he's a naive, intelligent, and very creative poet. He didn't know a word about Shakespeare because he was mainly interested in French poetry. And he is one of the Chileans who aspired, there are many, who aspired to become French writers. Because when I was a boy, I knew an old Chilean writer, and he told me, I have written my epitaph. And his epitaph said this: he wanted to become a writer, he became a Chilean writer.
One of the long-standing stories that's told about the Tempest is precisely that Prospero is Shakespeare, and that when Prospero decides to drown his book and stop his magical work and go back home, that is a statement of Shakespeare going into retirement in Stratford. The problem with that argument is that Shakespeare wrote 3 plays after The Tempest. We always think of The Tempest as the last play, but it wasn't the last play. He wrote 3 plays in collaboration after The Tempest. A play called Henry VIII, a play called Cardenio, which is missing. If anybody finds it, let me know, please. And a play called The Two Noble Kinsmen, which is a curious place to finish. The very last play, The Two Noble Kinsmen, is a rewriting of Chaucer's Knight's Tale, which of course Shakespeare had already done in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So it's Theseus and Hippolyta and A Midsummer Night's Dream again, but without the magic. So after The Tempest, Shakespeare writes another play which could have magic in it and removes the magic. And he's writing these plays together with the younger playwright, John Fletcher, about 15 years younger than Shakespeare, who would then take over as the main playwright for Shakespeare's company. Critics find it very, very difficult that Shakespeare collaborated. They don't like this. Shakespeare's a genius. Everybody else is just ordinary. What's he doing working with another writer? But he did. They all did. It was normal. Something like 2/3 of the plays in Shakespeare's day were collaboratively written. The only reason Shakespeare got the chance to write so many plays on his own is because he was the main playwright for the most stable acting company in London at that time. Financially, he was in a much better position than all of his fellow playwrights, who were spent most of their time in jail for debt, which gave them time to write plays, I suppose, but wasn't ideal. So the extent to which Shakespeare's plays seem to invite readings that tell you something about Shakespeare, and they always retreat from that and leave you guessing. They seem to invite it, but they also reject it. And that is, of course, because we approach these plays in a post-romantic way. the Romantics, late 18th century, early 19th century, reimagined creativity as the expression of selfhood. Shakespeare and his contemporaries simply didn't see it that way. They were imitating God's creation, and in order to do that well, they were using as their models previous writers, classical writers, and others, who had done a pretty good job already of imitating God's creation. So Shakespeare was an imitator. He wasn't a plagiarist. They understood that there was a difference between imitation and plagiarism. But he would have none of the sense we have of the primacy of originality. And yet, of course, for us, he was the most original writer ever.
If you try to be original, you risk being not original at all. And if you have a real talent and some liberty and freedom in the way of approaching the problem of writing or poetry or of the narrative, maybe you can be original or have some originality. I remember a bit of the way Neruda approached Shakespeare. It was completely naive, in fact, because Neruda thought that Romeo and Juliet, were a good piece about the Cold War that could be translated in relation with the Cold War. And so Montescos represented one side and Capuletos the other one. And so love between a man from one side and a woman of the other one could produce the reconciliation and the end of Cold War. It was a very utopian and ambitious idea at the same time. And his translation of Romeo and Juliet was made with that criteria, the idea of making something in the peace campaign of days for a better relation between the two blocks, the capitalist and the socialist bloc. Well, there it is. I think you can read it with and be amused now by that translation, but it is very far from a real possibility, because what I believe, at least, is that as a great poet, Shakespeare introduces us in contradiction and in matices, in a not solid type of identity, but in doubt, in contradiction, in the shadows of characters, more than in pure characters. And Neruda does this because of an ideological tendency in that moment. But Neruda was a very poor ideologist. He was a great poet, and he felt really the fascination of Shakespeare's poetry. But when he translated this into a theory, a political theory, it was rather weak, and it sounds very old-fashioned today. But I would like to add something about Cervantes and Shakespeare. I have been a reader of Cervantes, so irregular as a reader of Shakespeare, but in fact, I had the Cervantes Prize once in Spain, and I said, look, this prize is very good, I love to have it, but Cervantes never would have been able to win the Cervantes Prize. Because Cervantes was a poor devil. He was a fracasado for his life. And he was in jail because he had to touch contributions for the big armada and then for the state. And he was so bad in mathematics that he did wrongly the rendiciones de cuentas that we say in Chile. You know, this is a torture. I have been a diplomat in a part of my life, fortunately a very short part of my life. And for me, making the rendition, the accounts, telling that I bought 2 flowers to send to an ambassador, or some eggs to make an omelette in the embassy, was the most pure torture that I have experimented in my life. So I feel very identified with poor Miguel de Cervantes, who went into prison twice because making wrongly those accounts. And so Cervantes was a poor chap that made a genial novel, and he didn't know exactly what he was doing. He was not sure of doing a novel. He was making a text a bit monstrous, full of episodes in the side, and where he introduces everything, you know. Everything that was in his mind, in his memory, in his experience of the day in Spain. And Shakespeare was a very organized fellow. Mm-hmm. He was the owner of his theaters many times, and then he went to hear the pieces in the rehearsals, and when he thought that the part of the piece was not going to be convincing, he changed it in the moment. He was very, very able, and then he was a man of property because he invested his earnings in the theater very well, in pieces of land near Stratford and all that. So you see, the poor devil, Cervantes, makes a formidable Quixote, wonderful book, and a very powerful mind, an organized mind, and good investor makes an oceanic playwright. You know, as I am a bit francophone more than Anglo-Saxon, I know a bit of French literature and read much French. Victor Hugo wrote a wonderful big essay about Shakespeare. There he speaks about everything, you know, about himself a lot and all that. But he says one thing. He says there are oceanic writers. And he said, Aeschylus is oceanic, he's an ocean. And Shakespeare is an ocean. And Dante also. For him, Cervantes is not so big, it's more limited, but I think he didn't understand, Victor Hugo, the Spanish humor and the Spanish popular side that you can find in El Quijote. I think Shakespeare would have loved it, but he couldn't read El Quijote, I understand.
No, he did.
He did?
The that missing play that I just mentioned, that he wrote in 1612, Cardenio, it was, judging by the name, it was based on a character in El Quijote.
Yes.
So, because Shelton had translated Don Quixote in 1612, so right at the end of Shakespeare's writing life, it was possible for him to read Cervantes. It's just a little crossover just before they both die. But I wanted to pick up on what you were saying earlier about creativity and about originality and about definitions of originality, because the ostensible subject for this conversation is past and future of Shakespeare. And I don't know how many of you have been following the difficulties at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre recently. There's some nodding, I see some nodding. A new artistic director arrived at the Globe just this year, Emma Rice, and produced some performances of Shakespeare's plays. She did Midsummer Night's Dream. And contrary to the usual practice at the Globe, she put an enormous lighting rig in, and she gave microphones to all the actors. There's very loud music and a big set, so that the Globe didn't look like the Globe anymore. And of course, up until that point, the Globe had the Globe was designed, the Globe was created by Sam Wanamaker. He had this lifelong vision for rebuilding a authentic Shakespearean theatre. And so she has worked against the prior expectations of what that space is for. But the way the newspapers have reported it has been very polarized. It has been the idea of boring, antiquarian academics, they're terrible people, academics, on the one hand, and highly creative, imaginative directors on the other. I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, I certainly found going to see Emma Rice's Midsummer Night's Dream, I hugely enjoyed it. It was wonderfully imaginative, and it brought into play some of the amazing global energies that we had seen in the Globe Theatre back in 2012 at the time of the London Olympics, when they did this wonderful season called Globe to Globe, where they brought 35 companies from different countries around the world into the Globe, and they had 2 shows, and they simply performed in their way in that space, and it was just tremendous. They didn't use microphones, they didn't do any of that, they just projected into this glorious open-air space. I love the fact that Emma Rice's Midsummer Night's Dream deliberately brought some of that global energy into play. At the same time, it seemed odd that she didn't seem to trust the space. I mean, any of us who had spent any time in the Globe over the last 20 years know that a good actor can project marvelously out into the space of the Globe. And also, she simplified the text and made some of the words easier. You sort of think, well, do you not trust your actors? A, to be able to project, and B, to be able to make sense of the words for an audience who don't necessarily understand the words. After all, that's an actor's job doing Shakespeare. The audience are not going to understand everything in Shakespeare, but a good actor can convey meaning even if the words themselves don't necessarily have an immediate meaning for the audience. So it seems to me that there is a very complicated process going on here, and I've been really hating the coverage in the newspapers and in the media, because it sets the Globe project up as a conservative, heritage-based idea on the one hand, and it sets up some ideal of original imaginative directing on the other. And of course, neither of those is what it's about. The Globe is there. Any performance of Shakespeare has to... A performance of Shakespeare that just tries to replicate something that's happened before is not interesting. A performance of Shakespeare that tries to be in the moment now and forgets that anyone has ever done a production of Shakespeare beforehand is also limited, shall we say. The question is how to bring together what has been learned without just being repetitive. And I think what we're watching at the Globe is actually something which in microcosm is representative of the larger question of how to reimagine art from the past in the present, and how to project a future for performance of a classical playwright. And it's a struggle that has... you just wish that it didn't have to be so polarized. You wish that conversations could find ways to keep the energy but not lose the perspective.
I want to add a little thing about Cervantes Shakespeare, and then we can have questions of the public.
Sure.
Well, you know, Cervantes is also very different to Shakespeare because, in one thing, he was a hero during 5 or 6 hours in his life, in the Battle of Lepanto. And he was very sick in the battle, the day of the battle. He had 40 degrees of fever. And the captain of the ship told him to go to his bedroom. And he said, no, I want to fight in a dangerous place. And he said, for God and for my king. For God and for my king. And then in the rest of his life, he was enormously proud of having having received a bullet that made him, he couldn't use it. He didn't lost his arm or his hand, but he couldn't use it. And he was enormously proud of that. And he was not at all proud of having written El Quijote. He didn't find it so important. He also always insisted that he had been, herido in the battle. You know? And that he was a hero, and he was furious because the second part of the Quijote made by another one, by the Quijote de Avellaneda, moved him to write a second part to rectify what Avellaneda said. But he was not so interested in all that. And in the last writings of his life, he says, I am proud of having been herido, how you say in English, I forget. Blessé in French.
Injured, wounded.
Wounded. He was proud of having been wounded in the defense of the empire and God, who was part of the empire, I suppose. And Shakespeare is not such a reverent man, I would say. Not at all. Always the kings in Shakespeare are traitors or weak or monsters or little monsters and all that. And so Shakespeare, in a certain way, is a bourgeois, but of a very modern kind. Whereas Cervantes is a man full of nostalgia, of the ages of the gentlemen, of the caballeros andantes and all that. Very different characters. And I find a very fantastic modernity in Shakespeare. I don't follow Cott with his idea of Shakespeare, not a contemporary, but I find that Shakespeare is somebody who can be read with great interest today and who can open something for the future. So the past and the future in Shakespeare is a very interesting subject for me. I have to learn it and to read more. And I'm a bit old to read so much, but in my age now, the only thing I like in the world is to read and to write, and sometimes to take a bit of good wine.
Thank you for being here with us.